Would you want this device implanted in your brain like this? Interesting question. We're going to hear from Shivon Zilis from Neuralink, and we're going to hear from Joseph O'Doherty, also from Neuralink, hear how Neuralink is improving, how it's going to make life better for paralyzed people, blind people, other people with brain diseases, all kinds of great things, and how it might help you, me, and other healthy people live happier, healthier lives and survive the onslaught of artificial general intelligence. Are you ready? Let's go! Before I dive into what Shivon has to say and O'Doherty had to say, I want to quickly mention that Neuralink announced that they completed a funding round. They raised money so that they can pay more people like Shivon Zilis and Joseph O'Doherty to do more work to advance Neuralink further and help the species. They raised $205 million. Very clear that these were large venture capital funds. I think these are funds that are close to Elon, possibly the PayPal mafia. You can see Ken Howery, co-founder of PayPal and Founders Fund, involved here. I had been working on an investment group trying to get people together to form a fund to possibly invest in Neuralink. It became apparent that we didn't have enough money. I also thought that we were premature and that Neuralink wasn't going to be ready to do a funding round yet. It now appears I was wrong, though I think this funding round was only for big players and we were not going to have enough money. At best, the fund I was working on might have raised $5 million, and I don't think that would have been enough to participate, and we wouldn't have the connections to get involved in the first place. So I am hopeful that at some point in the future, other efforts will be made to try to create a venture fund, to try to get involved in the Boring Company or Neuralink or SpaceX or something similar. I don't see that happening in the near future, but I just wanted to mention this really quick. Neuralink has raised a big chunk of money that will let them do more, get them into human trials, get them through some significant human trials, and get closer to a viable product that can help people in the world beyond simple research. But now let's move on to Shivon Zilis. This is Shivon Zilis. She is a project director at Neuralink. Very, very bright young woman. Has a lot of interesting stuff to say. We're going to go through a conversation she had with a Canadian audience or a presentation, answering some questions towards the end. Let's start with Shivon Zilis.
So I think there's both a short-term and a long-term goal of Neuralink. The short-term goal is basically solve important brain and spine problems with a seamlessly implanted device. And, this is definitely easier said than done. Your brain is a very sensitive organ that has a whole bunch of things around it that historically just has never been messed with. We've been doing invasive things in medicine for, many hundreds of years, but definitely not dealing in the brain region because it's the trickiest task you can possibly choose for yourself. So that's definitely the short-term goal. And, if you think about it, every single component of your reality, everything you've ever touched, any memory you've ever had, anything you've ever felt, like all of this is just signals emanating from your brain. And so when we talk about creating a platform to directly interface with the brain, you have the potential just to modulate literally everything, right? Because everything is just these signals in terms of our experience in the world.
So that's the short-term goal. The short-term goal is to help people with brain diseases, brain injuries, help paralyzed people ultimately be able to move again, but in the short term, manipulate objects on a computer screen, interact with a computer, help blind people see, all kinds of problems that people have that might be helped, medical problems that might be helped by using Neuralink. That's the short-term goal. What's the long-term goal?
Our long-term reason for existence is something that's a little bit more science fiction oriented, but honestly, if you look at enough years, you're like, yeah, this is definitely going to be a reality. So, how do we make this good for humanity? And that's basically when the age of artificial superintelligence hits, right? So every single year, artificial intelligence gets more and more and more intelligent. Of course, now that's sort of within a constrained, controllable fashion, but if you look out 10 years, if you look out 50 years, if you look at 100 years, there's no reason this technology doesn't get basically more and more intelligent and more powerful year on year. And so if you contrast, humans to artificial intelligence or just basically silicon-based intelligence, I don't necessarily know that we'll consider it artificial forever. We've got a lot going on in our own heads, but the actual communication bandwidth between humans and computers is actually relatively low, right? So I'm showing you some images, I'm saying some words. The bit rate on that communication is relatively low compared with what computers can do with each other, or even to some degree what computers would be able to express to us if we had some sort of higher bandwidth opportunity.
A key detail is bandwidth. So our brains work really fast inside our skulls, but when we try to communicate with others, whether it's computers or people, we work slow. And artificial intelligence, when it gets super intelligent, when it becomes smarter than human and it communicates faster than human with itself or with other artificial intelligence, talking to us, I've heard this analogy, I think Elon Musk made this analogy, talking to humans or communicating with humans is going to be like us communicating with a tree. Our communication is going to be so slow relative to how fast artificial intelligence will be able to communicate that it will be almost pointless to communicate with us. So can we increase our communication bandwidth to the point where we're able to have more meaningful interaction with artificial intelligence, artificial superintelligence when that day comes?
This is one of these things that, again, it sounds way out there, but, as superintelligence hits the world, one of the things we kind of want to exist is just the optionality to have a high bandwidth interface with it. So we just keep high communications and, basically like allows humanity to go along for the ride.
Allows humanity to go along for the ride. The theory is that artificial intelligence, artificial superintelligence is going to become incredibly powerful, be able to travel off Earth, travel to other stars, etc., be able to do amazing things. And if we want to be able to participate that if we want to be able to go along for the ride, we have to be at least somewhat useful to the artificial intelligence. And the higher bandwidth we have, the more useful we'll be to the artificial intelligence. So that's kind of the goal.
Probability of us being able to do this successfully in the time frame allowed started at 0%. And so, we literally exist to raise that probability above 0%. We've been working really hard for the past 4 years. I think we've gotten the probability up to, generously 1 to 2%. And we just hope to keep elevating it from there.
The short-term goal is to help people, but the long-term goal is driven by a recognition by Elon Musk, by people at OpenAI, where Shivon Zilis used to and maybe still works, that artificial intelligence is coming, and this is an existential threat to humanity. If artificial intelligence comes along and decides we're not worth existing, it could wipe us out. Or it could just ignore us and leave us behind as it goes on to bigger and better things. So can we go along for the ride? There's a saying, are we a threat or are we a pet? The minute that artificial intelligence becomes smarter than human, it could view us as a threat. And one of our goals is to minimize the danger that it thinks of us as a threat, because if it's more powerful than us and it thinks we're a threat, it could wipe us out. If it thinks we're like a pet, maybe it takes us along for the ride. Could be a fun ride. And it's sort of like you can say we don't want that to happen, but it's going to happen. Whether it's 5 years from now, 50 years from now, 150 years from now, at some point artificial intelligence is likely to achieve superhuman intelligence and superhuman power, and we're going to have to either live with it or die with it. We'd rather live. Shivon's going to explain a bit about the brain here. Right now, let's listen to what Shivon says to explain a little bit more about how the brain works and how Neuralink interacts with the brain.
It's an electrochemical system. You've got a lot of neurons. You've got billions of neurons in your brain. They're connected to each other through synapses. So neurons have variable number of connections with other neurons, but a lot of what's happening in your brain is just basically a fundamental wiring and rewiring of these synaptic connections through time. And because the brain has electrical properties, one thing we can do is essentially put an electrode in the brain that allows it to hear electrical signals from nearby neurons.
Your brain operates by neurons sending out electrical signals. There's more to it. There's chemical signals. But the idea is that Neuralink is going to be able to listen in to the signals, and it's going to be able to transmit signals in. And we're going to hear more about that next.
Hey, why do you have to go inside of the brain for this? And there are a lot of things happening in terms of reading brain signals externally, but because our end goal, we have two goals. One is to just really fundamentally help people with debilitating brain disorders. And the other is to get to that high bandwidth interface. And just basically the physics of how this all works doesn't allow us to get to significant enough resolution on either a read or write dimension in terms of a brain machine interface. And so it would be our preference not to have to go inside the brain, but it's just, per our current understanding of physics, impossible to do it from outside.
So there are other devices that basically, there's one called Kernel, where they put something outside your skull and they try to listen in on your brain or observe what's happening inside your brain. There's something called fMRI. And these approaches they're not effective enough for what Neuralink is trying to do. Neuralink thinks they can do a lot better by going inside the brain. And we're going to hear more about it. Stay with me.
But what you're seeing is 64 individual threads. Each of those threads has 16 working electrodes on it. and those connect back up into the package. And so if you were to pull off one of these individual threads and look at it, you would barely be able to see it. And if you weren't holding onto it very close, it's just this teeny wisp of hair. It's about a third the width of a human hair that would just float off and you'd never be able to find it again. So we're trying to build something that small, something flexible, something that just kind of hides inside the brain and moves with the brain's material properties. And so we've ended up having to lean on a lot of microfabrication experts to basically build this thin film electrode array technology.
This is the Neuralink device at its current state. We're going to see a little bit more about this. What she was just talking about is the threads that are underneath this person's thumb. Those threads are extremely thin, and there's a reason why they need to be that thin, so that they don't bother the brain and lead the brain to respond. We're going to hear a little bit more about that next.
Several years of work of Neuralink to be able to get those electrodes thin, flexible, relatively invisible to the brain, and then obviously be able to integrate that with a broader electronics package.
Basically, Neuralink has been doing a lot of work to get these threads that thin and flexible. You can see the Utah array next to it. That's something that's been used in the past that's not thin and not flexible and causes trauma to the brain. If they do it right, this is the goal. It doesn't cause trauma to the brain, so you don't cause brain damage, and the brain doesn't respond in negative ways, making it harder for the implant to work. Let's look a little closer at the device.
So here's kind of the implant side of it, which is kind of half of what Neuralink is focused on from an engineering perspective. So again, 1024 channels. What we do is we needed to shrink it to a size, both in terms of width and height, that basically fills the cavity of the skull that we removed to insert it, right? So it ends up just being another piece of your skull at the end of the day. And then what we did is create an inductive charging system. So you basically, right now we have it like this. We are working on animal models, and we charge just with this little puck that's able to charge the implant through the skin without raising temperature or causing any other biological damage. And then what we'll do as we move to humans is, I'm pretty sure what it's going to end up looking like, and I can use a Canadian word, which is making me really happy. You probably have like a charging toque. I know here we have to call it beanie, which is just completely infuriating to me. So you basically have a charging hat that would allow you to charge it when you're not using it, or continue to charge it while you are using it.
The idea is you're going to have this device implanted in your brain, and one of the key goals is that no one will know it's there. Previous iterations of this and previous devices that were nowhere near this cool, you could see somebody had something attached to their brain. This is actually going to end up being under the skin, so no one will be able to see it. And by using inductive charging, you can charge it through the skin. You don't have to plug it in. You don't have to plug in a USB cable. You don't have to plug in a charging cable. You will be able to charge it from outside. And that will allow the device to work and stay in your head. If you have to leave an opening in your skin, that creates a much greater infection risk. It's a bad thing. So you want the whole thing implanted inside to minimize the danger that something bad will happen. So this over here is what the surgery room is going to look like initially. And Shivon's going to tell you about human trials.
We're looking to move to our first human patients in the next, say, 6 to 9 months. We're actually going through our initial FDA process right now.
In the next few clips, Shivon's going to talk about this surgery, and here's a start to it.
Our eventual goal is to make this as easy and simple as LASIK. The first surgeries will not be that, but that is the end goal. And in order to do that, one of the things, so we spend a lot of time and energy on robotics at Neuralink. One of the cool things about that is, I've had a lot of friends in robotics over the years, and robots are just cool. Like, they just absolutely are awesome. They're fascinating. But a lot of people sometimes build robots because they're fun and they're cool, but they're not necessary. In the case of Neuralink, the robot is just completely necessary for 2 reasons. And reason one is, I talked to you guys a little bit about the threads that we have to insert. It basically kind of operates like how a sewing machine would work. So there's a little loop at the end of the thread. And what our robot does, and I'll show you a video of it in just a second, it grabs each of those 64 threads and inserts them into a very specific area of the brain. And you could be the best human neurosurgeon in the world. You have absolutely no shot of doing this because you just need micron precision, right? And a human hand just can't possibly do that from a motor control perspective in the first place. But in the second place, there's just no way you'd be able to do it fast enough to be able to grab all of those threads and put them very precisely in the brain. We absolutely just fundamentally need a robot. Like, when we devised this device, we're like, well, we can't even think of this device without thinking of a robot surgeon. And so just as early as we were working on the implant, we were working on the robotic surgeon to actually be able to implant the device. And so the rough outline of what happens in the surgery is, again, you have to pull back a skin flap. You have to take out a portion of the skull. That's done by a human right now. And then you have our surgical robot come in, implant all of the different electrodes. And then you have the human kind of close up. And again, nothing percutaneous. Patient looks completely normal.
Nothing percutaneous means there's no openings in the skin. The device is completely inside and the patient looks normal. Two big benefits again, minimizes or nearly zeros the risk of infection moving forward, and it looks normal. You want to look normal. You don't want people to look weird.
And so now let me introduce you to the robot. So as you can see, the robot has a massive base. There are a few reasons why the robot's so big. So one, again, micron precision. We need a bit of weight there just to ensure that we're not wobbling all over the place. Thing two is we just have an insane amount of just optical technology. Again, it's mostly hidden by that shroud there. But we have a whole bunch of different wavelengths of passive optics, and then we have something called optical coherence tomography. And we actually have the highest resolution optical coherence tomography set up in the world. And what that allows us to do is compute a 3D map of the brain, because not only do we have to find a way to just insert around different blood vessels, but the brain's constantly pulsating. And if you want to get within a few micron precision with each of these insertions, we have to be able to very accurately track the brain in 3D space.
So you saw what the robot looks like. I thought a couple of important details here. The size of the robot. The robot has to be very massive so it's very stable, because it's doing some very, very fine manipulation in the brain, and you don't want it jiggling while it's doing that. It has to be able to do very, very fine manipulation, finer than a human surgeon can do, and it has to do it fast, faster than a human surgeon can do. And really cool stuff to be able to put this together. Let's listen to a little bit more about the surgery.
Anyone that hasn't seen brains before, I'm just gonna let this play a couple of times because it kind of shows one of the reasons why it's just absolutely critical to have a robot. You can see the vasculature on the top of the brain. And so if you think of something like a Utah array that just had that, that broad bucket of spikes, when they put that in, they're just puncturing a bunch of these blood vessels.
Notice here on the video how the threads go in and they're not hitting the blood vessels. And by not hitting the blood vessels, you don't cause bleeding, you don't kill brain cells. Very, very important. But let Shivon go on.
For reasons. One, it creates an acute and chronic immune response when there's just enough blood that you don't want to create that immune response. What that ends up doing is your brain sends a whole bunch of things like astrocytes and glia that just glom onto the electrodes. And basically tag them as a foreign body. And they're like, no, you're not doing this. We're going to shove you out of the brain and we're just going to coat you so you can't hurt us anymore.
This is going to come up in the question and answer session at the end. She's going to be asked about the immune response and what they're seeing, and it's pretty good news.
You obviously can't get brain signals when your electrodes are coated. And beyond that, sometimes if you do puncture one of these vessels, the blood vessels are there to oxygenate the cells. And so you're just going to knock out an entire column of the neurons that you're trying to record from.
So killing neurons is bad. Makes sense.
And so for us, this surgical robot, and again, I showed it to you in one quick slide here. This has been many years of work to get it to be this precise, to be able to grab the thread and insert it in the brain around the vasculature. And so one kind of interesting and funny thing about this whole situation is, you've got that robot that's just absolutely massive. The only part that interacts with the brain is that little needle, which starts its life as a 40 micron wide tungsten radium piece of wire. And then we have a femtosecond laser that reductively manufactures it with about 8 different cuts into this very precise geometry that basically grabs the thread and then is able to look at the brain, insert it, pierce through the meninges on top of the brain without causing damage, insert that thread, and then retract.
It's amazing to hear the level of complexity that they've gotten into to take this incredibly very small needle and then use a laser to cut it very specifically so that it can carry out this task effectively. The level of engineering, the level of talent, the level of work that goes into what Neuralink is doing is absolutely amazing, really impressive. This is why, and those of us who fear brain disease will get us in the future, those of us who want the problems of brain disease to be solved, not even thinking about helping us deal with artificial intelligence. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to people like Shivon Zilis and, of course, Elon Musk for advancing this kind of technology, something that's going to be really important for our future.
Do that 64 times in a surgery.
That last bit, it does it 64 times in a surgery. There's 64 threads coming out of the chip that go into the brain, so it implants 64 of them. It's going to come up a little later in the article with Joseph O'Doherty, but it's a lot later in this video. Of course, the fun part of any Neuralink video is either the pigs or the monkeys. Let's talk about the pigs.
These are very food motivated, and they're huge sweethearts. So you can see this piggy on a treadmill getting some snacks. She's walking, and essentially we're basically fitting a model to the motions that she's making. As you can see, predicts quite close to reality. 24-channel device in one hemisphere of the brain, tracking one half of the pig's body.
What you're seeing here is it is reading brain activity and seeing if the brain activity matches up with the movement of the legs on one side. They only put the Neuralink chip on one side of the pig's brain. They're only looking at one side of the body. This is just testing how it works in animal models. There's a limit, as she can explain later, there's a limit to what you can do with pigs, but they're doing this to see how it works, to see whether they're able to get useful information from the pig's brain. And so far they are. This is a good sign.
And so that's kind of as far as you can push on sort of like pig behavior. You can't really train a pig to do richer behaviors.
Can't train a pig to do richer behaviors. That's going to take us into monkeys at some point. Now, reading from the brain is one thing. Writing to the brain is another thing. The goal with Neuralink is to be able to do both. And Shivon is going to talk about the writing part, which seems like it might be harder, but we're not sure. Listen to hear what she has to say.
I think some of our first applications in humans, which I'll get into in just a moment, are going to be read heavy, just because that's the thing that's going to be more useful in cortex-based applications that we're focusing on right now. We've also just run the set of experiments we need to ensure that we are effectively writing information to the brain. And so the way we do this is done in primarily mouse models, just for debugging, inserting a fluorescing virus into a brain and stimulating in a way that when the neuron fires, you basically can see just light around it. So we've got two threads in here, which you can see in red. We're stimulating each of those threads, and you can see the neurons associated with, or just basically proximate to that thread, end up firing.
As they stimulate an area of the brain, the neurons near that light up. It means that the neurons are recognizing that the signal is sent in. A much larger challenge will be sending in the right signal in terms of the right, how loud does the signal need to be? How powerful does the signal need to be? And which neurons do you want to light up? What does that accomplish? There's a lot to come here, but they're making some initial progress on it.
So we're writing information into the brain. And when you zoom out, this is just essentially what you see. These are just different vertical slices of the brain, but you're seeing that when we stimulate, there is just gross neuronal activity in that region. And so one of the things we can do over time is see basically how little current we can inject to enact the change that we want to see. Just like a computer, these interfaces are going to be read-write compatible.
As you can see, monkeys coming, but the key there is they can write in. Over time, they will figure out how strong does the signal need to be and what else can they do with the signal. But the goal is to make it so that the device is read-write compatible. It can read from the brain, and it will also be able to write to the brain. It'll be able to take information from inside the brain out, so we'll be able to communicate out from our brains more effectively than we were before we had Neuralink. And also we may be able to transmit information into the brain more efficiently than we do now. The bandwidth, the access to the brain from outside goes through our eyes, goes through our ears. We don't have a lot of ways of getting information fast, and it may very well be that our brains can process information a lot faster if it comes in the right way, and that's a challenge. So I know it looks like we're about to talk about monkeys, but not yet. Shivon's going to explain a little bit more about what the goal is for people who are paralyzed and how this is going to help.
The thing that is most important to us is safely getting a useful device to humans in need as quickly as possible. What we're focusing on out of the gate is helping quadriplegics get digital freedoms back, right? So anybody who just has completely lost movement south of their neck, what they'll be able to do is essentially use a computer in the same way with the same fidelity that you or I could. And again, I think the first patient will be able to do it with some fidelity, but there's no reason that we couldn't get to essentially, again, the same bandwidth that you or I get. And I think the thing that I'm most excited about is, getting it to the level where, somebody who, used to love video games, for example, unfortunately, became quadriplegic, can just like whoop my ass at their favorite video game.
Seems like kind of a silly way of thinking about it, but that is something that's very meaningful to some people, that they used to get a lot of joy out of playing video games. And when they become quadriplegics, they can't play anymore. And it takes away a key joy in life. And her goal, one of her goals, something that she can relate to from what she's seen in life, is restoring the ability of somebody who loves playing video games to be able to play video games. That's something that Neuralink believes they can achieve fairly soon in early human patients.
And that is, of course, a little bit of a more fun application than others. But for somebody to be able to actually contribute back to society by doing meaningful work on their laptops, being able to stay socially connected to loved ones, that's the place that we're starting.
That's the place that we're starting. They want to help people be able to be productive, to meaningfully communicate with their families, to be able to give back to society, to give meaningful value back to life from people who've had it taken away as a result of a brain injury that took away, or a spinal cord injury that took away their ability to use their bodies and basically took away their ability to contribute. Maybe Neuralink can help people get back to doing useful work, at least from their brains. And she doesn't really talk about it in this video. Elon talks about the idea of doing a neural shunt around the spinal injury and allowing people to regain use of their limbs, but we're not there yet. That's not going to come up in this video, but really great to hear the passion that Shivon has for this. And I know you've been waiting for it. Let's hear about the monkeys.
Primarily right now is we're inserting our devices into both hemispheres, focusing on the motor cortex. And we're having the monkeys do specific tasks. And so Elon had mentioned in a Clubhouse Clubhouse interview presentation, whatever you call it, the cool kids are calling it these days. But he had shared just at a high level one thing that we have been working on, which is monkeys playing Pong with their brains. I won't share in too much detail right now because we're going to have something coming out in the next couple of weeks. But it's pretty cool. Monkeys are playing Pong with their brains. Primarily, we worked on motor cortex. One thing we were also putting a bit of effort into is also inserting these devices into visual cortex, with the thought that our second or maybe third application in humans will be just visually reconstructing images for people who are blind. And so what that looks like right now is essentially using the devices to read the information that's coming in through the monkey's eyes and basically recomputing that on a screen, so you can at least see kind of coarse imagery. And our goal is to improve the resolution of that over time.
Goals to improve the resolution of that over time. So interesting detail here. You can see that the monkeys have bilateral implants. They don't just have one implant for one side like we saw with the pigs. This is both sides. That's important so that the monkey can use left and right arms, or imagine using left or right arms, and the visual cortex left and right eyes. Again, critical goals here. Can we help blind people see? Can we use the visual cortex on the monkey to see what the monkey is seeing and try to reconstruct what those images look like? Can we then help blind people see? Really important stuff. Really glad that people at Neuralink are working on things like this to help with serious problems with people who have serious problems. Before we dive into the next bit, I just want to mention that this video was recorded several months ago before the monkey mind Pong video dropped. She mentioned that, what she was talking about was something that was going to come out later. There's probably a lot of stuff that has happened since then, but it's really interesting to get this perspective. And for some reason, this video dropped in February. It was on YouTube, but no one noticed it. And then it only became noticed more recently. And really still not that many people have watched this video. I'll put a link to the video in the description below.
I just talked a little bit about, this final monkey demo is kind of functionally the last step on the path to humans. We have them working on tasks like Pong, but we also have them working on tasks that are extremely similar to what a human's going to want to use out of the gate. And so this is just a render of what the Neuralink app will look like. So there's a calibration phase where, you essentially ask the patient to think, move to the right. And as it moves to the right, it trains the model. And then once you figure out right, left, up, down, what you can do is finer granularity and basically move in a circle like you saw here. So monkeys are currently performing that task as well, and they're doing quite well at it. And then once you get beyond that, you can see, you could get a very rudimentary keyboard out there that would basically allow a human to just basically type out whatever they're typing out.
The first step is to just get the first human, or get the monkeys to move a cursor on the screen. Can we get to the point where humans can input letters of the alphabet? The initial way that she just mentioned is by essentially using the same motion, just move the cursor to the letter and select the letter, but it gets better.
In this case, you are using just basically sort of like 2D control with a click. As we move further down the line, there are existence proof to show that we might be able to shortcut a whole bunch of different things, like in the same way that you have that little swipe function in your phone instead of just like tapping buttons and you have autocomplete. You could do things like that, or you could even tap into language areas of the brain and transcribe just basically full words or full thoughts based on neural patterns. So it's the future is going to get super, super interesting.
The future is going to get super, super interesting. I love the way she talks. An existence proof. She's really deep into the science and what has been done in neuroscience to try to figure out how are we going to achieve this. And it's, impossible for her to communicate the depth of the science that she knows, but it's so obvious that she's way smarter than I am when I watch this video. And I'm really excited to see really, really smart, really, really motivated people working on really, really important problems that are going to make our lives better. Okay, this bit's in here just because I love the way she talks, and there's something she says here I just really love.
Models that understand, like neural networks for our neural networks. Like right now, it's mostly linear models just because we're working in motor cortex, but it's going to get meta pretty soon. Neural networks on neural networks, and it's just been anyway. It's been a super fun experience. I'm stoked to be able to share a little bit with you guys.
So this is the end of the talk, and before she gets into the Q&A, but I just love how she talked about getting meta. It's going to get meta. She's talking about neural networks working on neural networks. Your brain is a neural network, and they're going to use neural networks to figure out how the neural network works. And they may be using neural networks to work on the neural network that's interacting with the brain. It's going to get meta. And this was towards the end of the talk. She's talking about all the help they need, all the people they want to hire in all these fields. They're really growing the company to be able to do that. If you are an engineer who's interested in any of these fields, or you work in animal care, if you're in any of these fields, Neuralink wants more people. Send your resume to engineering@neuralink.com. Really excited about this. I think this is great stuff. There were some really good questions and even better answers in the Q&A. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
By your estimate, approximately how long do you think it'll be until healthy humans can start getting the neural implant?
Healthy humans refers to the original thing that Neuralink is going to be doing is treating people with brain diseases or other injuries, people who are not healthy, and can Neuralink help people who are not healthy become healthy? But the vision, the long-term vision is, can we help people who are otherwise healthy use Neuralink to interact with AGI or for other purposes? It's a really interesting answer here from Shivon.
It's a good question. I think part of this is predicated on the what. So a lot of what I showed you guys is what we've been focusing on out of the gate is cortex-based applications. So your cortex is obviously like at the top, is quite accessible. Once you make that craniotomy, you're just basically inserting directly into the brain region that you want to read and write to. For cortex-based applications, again, I mentioned quadriplegics were the first set of patients that we were going to serve, in part because there's just huge need there, and in part also because there's no loss. Like I mean, if you're quadriplegic, you're not using your motor cortex to move your body, right? So we're inserting into unused brain just to give upside.
We're inserting into your brain just to give upside. In other words, if you're not using your motor cortex anyway, then it's not like we're going to cause any damage. And any positive we can get out of the motor cortex is something you weren't getting out of the motor cortex before.
I think there are a bunch of different paths that we could take. So that could get so high bandwidth that you or I may eventually want it, right? Just in terms of a direct interface with our computers. I think that's less probable for first applications for healthy humans. Another thing that we've been thinking about and talking about a lot is a lot of the most paralyzing ailments for humans tend to be in deeper brain regions.
This is really important because everything I've heard from Elon before, everything I've heard about Neuralink before was about things that are on the surface of the brain. So you cut a hole in the brain and you do a very, very shallow implant, just a couple of millimeters. She's talking about deep brain implants. So I don't know technically how they're planning on getting the thread to deeper in the brain, but the fact that she's going there is very interesting, and I'm curious to see down the road. We're going to see where this is coming. And she thinks this is something that might happen before we try to do high bandwidth, let us interact with our computers faster, because this is still, it's healthy, but it's like maybe there are issues that can be helped with that. All right, you're healthy, but this part of your life could be better if we could do this.
PTSD, anxiety, obesity. There are a lot of things that just get, again, like extreme depression to the point where you're suicidal. Like some of that stuff just doesn't have kind of chemical remedies, and things like insomnia, for example. So if you're able to access deep brain regions, you can treat a whole bunch of other ailments, but that also may be the shorter path to translating into something that would help a healthy human. Like as an example, for me, I'm like, well, I don't have insomnia, but like, sometimes getting to sleep at night is a little bit tricky. If you had something that was truly at the invasiveness of LASIK, that could help you get to bed and help you get like a full night of rest, I mean, you'd be kind of crazy not to get it, right? And so that happens to be the thing that I'm particularly interested in, just in terms of the first thing I would want.
I love how she relates this to herself. And I think we all do that. We all see these things and, well, how would I use that? Sometimes we do too much of it, but just the way she explains it makes it really relatable.
A lot of people have different answers to that question. So if you were looking for something that, again, just unequivocally is going to take you to better control like of your computers and your digital devices and be your default way of interacting, you're probably looking at 12 to 15 years, again, pending FDA cycles and various other things like that. But if you're looking for something, I have a sneaking hypothesis that some of the deeper brain implants will be desired by relatively healthy people on a shorter time scale. But again, on the earliest, you're looking at 7 to 10 years plus whatever additional regulatory cycle is required to make it just like universally available.
It's pretty surprising to hear her time frame. We always have Elon time, but Shivon here is basically saying, hey, I think we can get there just to help people, let's say help you get to sleep. We may get there in 7 to 10 years plus some regulatory timing. And we might be able to help people interact at high speed with their computers in 12 to 15 years. That's not, it sounds far away in a sense, but that's really not that far away. I'm 55 and my goal is to get a Neuralink by the time I'm 70, 75, because I have a family history of Alzheimer's, so I'm going to personalize it to me. If I can get something that helps me get past Alzheimer's, if you're telling me it's 15 years away and I'm going to have it by the time I'm 70, I'm all right with that. That sounds cool. I'd like it to be quicker, of course, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. At like Neuralink, we think in months, and people are like, "Oh, what's 6 months out?" And we're like, "It's 2 weeks." Like, I don't know.
2 weeks.
Yeah, well, the ambition, it's definitely getting the job done. Have you guys actually kind of delved into some of the emotion, kind of like the deeper brain stuff that you were talking about, or is that something that's just not too high of a priority, a little bit farther off?
One thing I think I didn't probably explain clearly enough is there are a lot of folks within the neuroscience community and research that are targeting very specific things. One of the things that we've been focused on is just there's literally a chicken and egg problem, right? Where like there is no fundamental brain platform that exists. And so both our understanding and our ability to treat are just hamstrung right now because humanity just does not get how the brain works en masse. And so for us, a lot of people will be like, hey, should we partner up on things? Should we do this? And we're like, guys, we can't wait. Like as soon as we have this like stable brain platform that we can, allow others to use or use ourselves for fundamental understanding of the brain, like that would be sweet. We're like focused on the engineering and the biology of it right now.
This concept of a fundamental platform, the idea is that Neuralink is going to get to a point where it is a basic platform that we can build things off of, just like Windows is something you can build things off of. The Intel computer with Windows, the Macintosh computer, Android or iPhone, you can build applications off of a fundamental platform. So Neuralink can serve as a fundamental platform that lets us learn more about how the brain works and then lets us do more to help people who have problems in the brain and help researchers apply it to different areas of the brain to learn more about the brain in different ways.
And again, we are learning things about the brain, but it's just like, it's so early days compared to what things will look like in 5 to 10 years. So understanding the underpinnings of like what fundamentally governs more complex emotions, like we're just not there yet. Like we're like a little bit there as humanity by virtue of some fMRI and related experiments, but like, it's been very humbling because the brain is the thing I think humanity understands least out of like, I think, for example, like the AI we've created is way, way, way in excess of how much we understand how much our own brains work, right? It's just super early.
We really, really, really don't understand how the brain works. We've created AI. We don't really even understand how AI works, to be honest, but we've created AI. We have a sense of how our AI works, the AI that we've created, but we just really don't have a full grasp on how the human brain works. And Neuralink is going to get us a lot closer to that. And that could give us access to solving all kinds of problems, including emotional problems, which Shivon is basically saying we're not close enough to even begin to talk about that. We've got a long way to go. And, they've got that long time horizon. That's the beauty of having someone like Elon Musk running your company is he doesn't need to deliver a product to market next year. There's no time horizon. Elon is funding this out of his own pocket for now. Maybe he'll do a venture capital raise at some point, but this is just an important issue and Elon can afford to do it. So let's hire a bunch of people and let's get some good work done and let's see how far we can get. We talked about immune response earlier and I told you it was going to be in a question. Here it is.
How do you sort of touched on this a bit, but if you could go into like a little bit more detail about mediating the immune response from the electrodes?
We talked about two things, and the two things we talked about were just as much as possible matching the material property of the brain. and doing everything we can do to prevent an immune response that would be caused by bleeding. Is blood in a place where it's not supposed to be? So those are two of the things that we focused on. Another thing that we've worked on, and again, I mentioned we have some more fundamental biological talent at Neuralink. You can do things like coat the electrodes in different proteins and just basically different compounds that do also mitigate immune response. And you can also just do the very simple things like you administer antibiotics and various other things at time of surgery. But it's basically those are the four mechanisms that we have to reduce overall immune response over time. The histology in our animals right now looks quite good, and we wouldn't be working to take it to humans if the histology did not look good.
The histology looks good. That means when they insert the threads into the brain and they do that, they're not seeing a response from the immune system trying to reject the implant. It looks really good. Things are going really well. Not that they can't get better, but it's going really well, and they're happy to see that.
And honestly, I don't think we have pushed as hard as we can yet on the third thing I mentioned, which is just, again, biological coatings that mitigate immune response. But both the teeny tiny size, the material property, and the fact that we avoid all vasculature and move with the brain once it's in has actually, we've been really pleasant. I don't want to say pleasantly surprised, like this was the design goal from the beginning, but the immune response is relatively minimal.
So it's working really well, really good sign. Still want to do better. They're still looking at how they can make it better. The flexible threads allow the threads to move with the brain. The Utah array has stiff electrodes that stick in and don't move with the brain, so it causes damage. So many good things. They have coatings on the threads so that they don't alert the brain that there's a problem. They don't cause bleeding. Making great progress. Everything's looking really good. Very excited to see this. So I skipped over, there was a question about hacking, and Shivon's short answer to the hacking question was, it's not something we need to worry about yet. They need to get the device working in humans first. And the humans are sort of walled off. There's no outside access to get in and hack it. They do have great people who will be working on that when the time comes, and they are thinking about it a little bit, but it's just really premature to worry about hacking. Next, we're going to talk about the potential for overstimulating the brain.
What are the concerns about needing to detach the technology to prevent overstimulation?
In terms of detaching to prevent overstimulation, I mean, this device just obviously can be shut off at any time. A lot of the applications that we're talking about out of the gate are primarily read-only, and so you're not really talking about injecting current. And if you're talking about injecting current, it's very small amounts of current. And I think this is something that we're going to have to learn slowly through time. If I look at the second half of this question, so it's when talking increasing the bandwidth, there are just a lot of things that we don't know yet.
So first of all, if most of the applications involve reading from the brain, then overstimulation is not an issue because the brain is sending information out, not the other way in. I suppose there's an argument that if you're able to send out information faster, maybe somehow you'd be overstimulated, but it doesn't seem likely. And then when they do send current into the brain, it's a very low charge. So that shouldn't be overstimulation, but it's something they'll worry about. It's something they'll be careful about, but doesn't seem to be a big problem yet.
Like if you could write more information to the brain, what form does that take? Basically, like how much of it is actually usable. I think one hypothesis for how this ends up working is there are going to be things that are richer and more information dense than traditional language. So right now, like I have these complex concepts that I'm trying to communicate to you. The most efficient thing humans have is, like, we created the technology that is language, right? And language works in written format. Language works in verbal transference format. I think one strong hypothesis is that there's going to be an eclipsing technology to language once you have brain-to-brain communication. It's unclear exactly how that's going to work. And obviously, if you were just like hardcore stimming a bunch of portions of the brain, what does that lead to? That leads to seizure, right? And so you can't have that.
I just love that part about an overarching eclipsing technology that at some point they believe at some point, and Elon has mentioned this in interviews, they believe they may come up with some way of brain-to-brain communication that sidesteps language and you're able to communicate concepts directly without having to translate them into words. I have a concept in my head. I figure out how am I going to say that in words. I say the words to you. You listen to the words. You try to interpret from my words. What concept did I mean? Would communication be a lot more efficient if we had a direct link from my brain to your brain and I communicated the concept through some eclipsing technology? Really interesting stuff there.
I think one of the things that's going to happen, in addition to the ability to, again, electrically write to the brain, is to just have more core fundamental technologies for how information is transferred. But again, you can shut it off at any point. And again, it's just so easy to do things. Like one one beautiful example of an invasive brain device today is epilepsy monitoring systems, right? They're both read-write. I think it's the only example of a functional read-write device, but the thing that they're trying to read is just gross activity in the brain, which is a seizure, right? And so one thing you can do with these devices is you are reading all the time, right? If you get any inkling that there might be some semblance of like runaway overstimulation, you just stop or you apply corrective force. And so preventing things like seizures is, I think, relatively trivial. Figuring out how to like cram more information into, every signal is, again, just an unsolved.
Cramming more information in. If you ever watch the movie The Matrix, Neo learns Kung Fu. They just jam a cartridge in and load his brain up with how to do Kung Fu, just like that. I think that's a ways down the road. That's not something they're worried about. But I thought the point about that there are currently devices that use stimulation in the brain when somebody is having an epileptic seizure to stop the seizure, that it seems like that should be something that wouldn't be that hard to achieve. To be able to, if you're worried you're overstimulating the brain, obviously you just stop, or maybe you find a way to stimulate in a different way to reduce the overstimulation. And now we get to hear how Shivon thinks things could go far into the future.
What would you say your goal is, looking very far into the future, as unrealistic as it seems?
I mean, honestly, the thing I care most about, I just want AI to unfold in the world in the best way possible. I mentioned shorter term, that ends up being, we're going to create this technology anyway. How do we double down on using it for net good? One reality, and this is something I couldn't even talk about 3, 4, 5 years ago, is the notion of superintelligence. It's like some people think this could be incredibly dystopian. They think it could be the end of humanity. Some people think this could be incredibly utopian, right? And so I think one of the things that's really, really hard for us to see and predict is what set of actions can we take to just like maximize the probability that we get that good future, right? Utopia is always tricky, but like basically a future where humanity is actually flourishing.
Maximize the probability that the future is good. And where humanity is flourishing, the goal, that's the goal. The goal is, can Neuralink help make it so that when artificial superintelligence comes along, that humanity continues to flourish or flourishes even more? Is that utopian? Is there a dystopian future that we're worried about? Sure, but maybe we can make things better. Maybe we can minimize the risk that bad things happen.
And so one of the things, and I think for whatever reason, naturally growing up, I was always looking many years into the future, is what can we do now? And it's actually really tricky to understand what we can do now. I mean, Neuralink is one of, I think, maybe 50 actions we could take right now that just basically maximize the probability that AGI and humanity kind of can coexist in good possible ways. I mentioned I also work with OpenAI, and one of the goals there is to ensure that as this technology is developed, it's developed in a way that includes many parties. It's not just going to be one person runaway advantage with this kind of like really, really big and important technology that gets to decide what to do with it. And so I think, fundamentally, I have a few goals. One is that, humanity as a species gets to participate in decisions made about AI, AGI as it unfolds in the world. And we have a bunch of democratizing forces that allow for that participation. I think two is, again, like one of the things we're working on at Neuralink is basically ensuring we get to go along for the ride. Like we're literally creating a species. I think even if we didn't want to create it, the fundamental nature of this is that what is AI? It's compute, it's algorithms, it's data, right? Like someone's going to make it from a game theory perspective. Having mechanisms like high bandwidth brain machine interface that allow us to stay very close to this thing, I think is kind of just super amazing and important. And I also think just from like a humanity perspective, you always want just diversification of continued existence and essentially enough inspiration to get you through the day. So it's like, some of the stuff I work on is like, how do we prevent bad things from happening? But then some of the other stuff is just like, hey, like it's so much cooler to wake up when humanity's trying to solve a whole bunch of inspiring problems. And so whether or not you're working on climate change, making life multiplanetary, or, just like future of like AI created or human created art, like we just need good reasons to wake up every day, even in a scenario where, kind of technology has taken just a different direction. So I think my goals, as you've kind of seen from this answer, are like somewhat diffuse, but there's just like a whole array of things where you're just like, oh man, we can like increase the probability the future's gonna be like awesome. I just basically try and divide my time and hours on as many of those things as I can like productively help.
That's really cool stuff. I'm personally very excited to see that someone so bright and promising, and there's so many people like her working at a company like Neuralink to make our future better. Next, we're going to move on to Joseph O'Doherty. So hold on your hats. This is going to be fun too. Okay, so Joseph O'Doherty's article, this is in the IEEE Spectrum, link to that in the description below. He talks about some of the same things up here that Shivon was talking about keyboard control and mouse control to individuals with paralysis. He talks about pushing toward an able-bodied typing rate, not just being able to type in the computer, but being able to type fast at the same speed as a human. Talking about, can we, as he says down here, talking about an internal goal of trying to beat the world record in terms of information rate from the BMI, the brain-machine interface. And so there's a question, what's the best performance? How much further beyond that can we go? They're working on that. Really cool. They're trying to meet that goal, beat the world record, nail down what they can or can't, figure out why not, and try to make the device better. Great start. There's some great questions from Spectrum here. They ask a little bit about the design, which he's going to get into more later in this, but he just talks about threads that are extremely small and flexible is good for the long-term life of the device. Talks about the immune system, the same thing that Shivon talked about. A lot of challenges, a lot of techniques. They're making progress. Trade-offs between size and robustness, but the key goal, as he says at the bottom here, we need to have this working for many, 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 many days. The totally different solution space, that's really important. If you're going to put it in the brain, you don't want to have to take it out. It's got to last a very long time. This next bit, he gets into the specifics of the device. And you can see right now we're doing 16 contacts per thread. Before they were doing 128 electrodes per thread, you can see in the question. And they found that the earlier devices were denser, but it was overkill. Having a lot of electrodes on the thread meant that they could really characterize individual neurons, but it required a lot of density, meant more power requirements, and that's great for neuroscience, but maybe it's not good for a functional product. And the idea here is let's go for a functional product, something that can be used to help people. So that's why they changed the design to go back from 128 electrodes down to 16 electrodes on a thread with 64 threads. It adds up to 1,024 channels. They're testing other configurations like 128 by 8 and 256 by 4 to see if it helps with performance. And they have flexibility to try any configuration of 1,024 electrodes. So they're trying different things, but right now it seems like the 16 electrodes by 64 threads is the best plan for now. And further down, he says that the actual hardware is a 256 channel chip, and there's 4 chips in the device. That adds up to the 1,024 channels. Upgrading software, they're constantly working on the next thing, and they're basically applying good sound engineering principles to making the improvements they're making to make sure that it's safe. Safety is really, really important. The next section, the O'Doherty interview, Spectrum talks to him about more. Spectrum asked O'Doherty about spike detection, and O'Doherty explained there's different approaches. He talks about one approach where you look at, on a very small level, which neuron generated the spike, which spike was it, and there's a computational problem that involves a lot of work. There's another extreme where you just put a threshold on your voltage, you see if something crosses, and you just count them, and that's another extreme. But neither of those is really good for what they're trying to do. So those extremes are not great for them. What are they trying to do? With one approach, you have a lot of computation that you can't really do in the small package. With the other approach, you get sensitive because you have a lot of noise and artifacts. So they're using an approach in the middle where they're looking for shapes that look like the signals that neurons generate. They transmit those events with a few extra bits of information, like how tall, how wide. And that's something they were doing external to the device before. And they were able to take what they learned and develop an algorithm and put it in the hardware so it's in the chip. And it detects spikes and sends them out to the decoder. So they're doing some on-chip processing inside the skull, on the chip inside the skull. They're actually doing some on-chip processing. And that helps make it work better. Up at the top here, O'Doherty explains how the data comes out. It works out to about 20 kilobytes per second. And they use some compression. That compression is possible because they're doing spike detection with their algorithm on the chip. So the maximum bandwidth would be 1,024 channels times 20,000 samples per second. It's a really big number, but the compressed version reduces that a lot. So that means that they have to use a lot less data transmission, and using data compression helps get information off and on the chip in a usable way. And they're using what he calls closed loop control. And then there's a question, what do you mean by that? He says most machine learning is open loop. With open loop machine learning, you have time to analyze something and figure out what it is. But here, the user's in the loop. This is happening real time for the user, so it needs to be resolved quickly. So closed loop control makes it happen quickly. And he uses this example. If you throw a ball to me and it takes my brain machine interface 5 seconds to infer that I want to move the arm forward. That's too late. I'll miss the ball. So the user changes what they're doing based on visual feedback with a closed loop. The user makes a motor intent. It's decoded by the Neuralink device. The intended motion is enacted in the world by physically doing something with a cursor or robot arm. Notice the decision is being made in the chip what to do, what your intent was to transmit to your arm or to a mouse or to a keyboard. And that happens in real time rather than having to go out to some device externally, process it, and come back. Really, really important to not have a lag, because that would be very uncomfortable for the user, for the person who has this device in them. So Spectrum asks, what are you guys working on now to make things better? And one of the concerns is latency, that if you have things that are slowing the system down, and that slows everything down, and that makes it uncomfortable, and that affects the comfort for the user who's trying to get something done and it takes longer than he wants it to. So Spectrum then says, okay, so let's suppose you get past latency. What's next? And step 2 is the decoder itself. And the goal here is to get the decoder, the thing, it's decoding the signals from the brain. It has to work really, really fast and be really, really accurate. So they have to keep working on making the decoder work faster and more accurately. And that probably is going to ultimately involve neural network training, although he doesn't talk about that here. They're having a very complex or very nonlinear model, or if they're having linear models that are very simple, trying to find the right way to get it done, and that's something that they're working on now. Other factors are the speed that you can calibrate the decoder to the user. It takes a long time for the user, the person who's got the device in them, to get used to training it. That's not a great experience. So that can they get it so that you can train the device more quickly on it's how you move the mouse, how you use the keyboard. Those are things they're working on. And he says right now they're going to have to calibrate the device to the user, the decoder to the user. They want to get to the point where the decoders calibrate themselves without even the user thinking about it. That sounds like a stretch goal, but you got to have your stretch goals. An example of what they're doing here is if the user starts moving the mouse towards a button that they want to click on, if they can detect, okay, this means he's probably going to click on that button, and they can click on the button quicker, that makes it makes the selections faster. That makes it more comfortable for the user. So the goal is just, can they make it easier for the user to learn the device? And then cool stuff like if you type faster with 2 fingers than 1 finger, or text faster with 2 thumbs versus 1 finger, imagine using this decoding movement intention for 2 thumbs to control your brain-controlled keyboard and mouse, and that could boost performance. And these are the types of things that how can we make this thing faster and more intuitive and better at detecting what you're trying to do so it works quicker and you feel more comfortable with it. So right now the maximum bit rate of using brain-machine interfaces is a little bit over 6 bits per second, and for non-human primates 6.5 bits per second. And they're trying to achieve best-in-world brain-machine interface with non-human primates. There's this question about, can you do all this stuff with non-human primates, or do you need to get in humans to prove this best-in-the-world speed of brain-machine interface performance? And he's saying, to some extent, they have to make inferences. They do still feel, if you can see at the bottom, they're still working on things they can do with humans, but it's still valuable to use non-human primates and other animal models for proving out the technology to make it work. Ultimately, I think if you want to get a high bit rate, monkeys can't understand the same level of concepts that human can understand. Monkeys are pretty good and they'll do tasks, so they are getting something. But in the long run, my guess is humans will be better. But he is saying no, in principle, it's not clear that one is superior to the other for this particular purpose, because monkeys are motivated and they'll do the task they need them to do. So it's really interesting. Next question, are there reasons you think it might not work? 2D cursor control is not a very high dimension task, and there might be limits around that. So at some point he's concerned they're going to hit a limit because the brain can't keep up. If the cursor is going too fast, the user won't even see it moving. So the limits are going to come from what it means to move a cursor around. We'll have to think about other interesting ways to interface with the brain to get beyond that. Other ways of communicating might be better. Maybe it will involve 10-finger typing. Maybe you can tap into the part of the brain that controls the fingers and do typing with that, and maybe that will work more effectively. It's an open question where that ceiling is. Spectrum asked about just using cursor control. Can you imagine any test would go beyond that for non-human primates? And he says non-human primates can learn other more complicated tasks. It's lengthy training. We now know that monkeys can play Pong, but can they play Fruit Ninja? That's a training challenge, but he thinks that monkeys could conceivably play a game like Fruit Ninja. Fruit Ninja is a game where fruit drops and you got to cut it with a sword. And Spectrum asks at the end of the article, is there anything else you want to emphasize about that technology, the work you're doing? He said, I started working on BMI in an academic environment, and the concerns at Neuralink are different from an academic demonstration. They were interested in the product, user experience, robustness, and having worked for a long time. And these lead to different optimizations than if you're just doing a demonstration. They enjoyed the Pong demo, but they're not there to make Pong demos. That's just a teaser for what's possible. We bring the product to market. They want to bring a product to market that will help people. That's what you hear from Elon Musk. That's what you hear from Shivon Zilis, and you can hear it here from Joseph O'Doherty. Neuralink is trying to help people. They're trying to make a difference. So I got to tell you, I'm really excited about Neuralink. I'm a little concerned that this stuff is going over my head, and I don't really understand this stuff as well as I'd like to. O'Doherty's article was a little harder for me. I think Shivon Zilis' explanations were clearer and easier to understand. But maybe that just means I really don't understand. I don't know. I don't know how you feel. I'd love to hear. Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, of course, please check out my other videos. Please support this channel on Patreon. I want to thank the Vasa Law Firm in Sweden and all my Patreon supporters for helping this channel grow. Check out the merch, Machine That Builds the Machine, all kinds of t-shirts at elonbits.com. And thank you so much for watching.